Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep, really deep, into Syrian politics.
Specifically, Bashar al-Assad.
Yeah, Bashar al-Assad. You've sent us a ton of articles, research, all about him.
It seems like you really want to understand this guy.
And his family, right. They've held on to power in Syria for over 50 years.
It's pretty incredible, isn't it, how one family's story is so intertwined with everything. I mean, the Cold War, the rise of ISIS,
The Syrian Civil War.
the refugee crisis. It's a lot.
So let's unpack it all, shall we?
Let's do it.
Okay, so we know Bashar al-Assad took over from his father, Hafez al-Assad.
Right.
But before we get to Bashar, I think it's important to understand how this dynasty came to be in the first place. Like, how did they rise to power?
Okay, so it all starts with Hafez al-Assad. This guy, he came from really humble beginnings, but he managed to work his way up, through the ranks of the Ba'ath Party.
Ba'ath Party?
Yeah, it was a major force in Syrian politics back then, advocating for pan-Arabism, socialism, that sort of thing.
Gotcha. So how did Hafez go from party member to president? What happened?
Well, let's just say he was ambitious and maybe a little ruthless.
A little.
Okay, maybe more than a little. He staged a coup in 1970, and by the next year, boom, he's president. That's how the Assad dynasty began.
And this wasn't just like nepotism or something. He had a real strategy for securing his power, didn't he?
Absolutely. Hafez was an Alawite, right, which is a minority sect in Syria.
Right.
So he very strategically placed other Alawites in key positions. The military, the government, you name it.
So it was all about loyalty, ensuring his base was strong.
Exactly. It really shaped the entire power structure in Syria, and those effects are still being felt today.
Wow. Okay, so for 30 years, Hafez ruled Syria with an iron fist.
That's one way to put it.
I mean, it's the truth, right?
Yeah.
But during that time, was he aligned with any major global powers?
Oh, yeah. Big time. He was tight with the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
Ah, so he had a powerful friend.
It definitely gave him a lot of leverage on the world stage, that's for sure.
So this is the world Bashar al-Assad is born into. This tightly controlled, strategically aligned Syria. But he wasn't always meant to be the heir, was he?
No, not at all. Bashar, he was actually training to be an ophthalmologist in London, of all places.
Wait, an eye doctor?
Can you imagine?
Yeah.
From examining eyes to running a country.
That's why.
It really is. But something happened that changed everything.
Yeah, what was it?
Tragedy, really. Bashar's older brother, Basil, he was the one being groomed for leadership. But then, in 1994, he dies in a car accident.
Oh, wow.
Just like that, Bashar is thrust into the spotlight. He's forced to prepare for a role he never expected.
So 2000 rolls around, Hafez dies, and Bashar takes over.
Yeah.
What was the global reaction at the time? Did people think you'd be a reformer?
There was some hope, particularly in the West. A lot of people thought, okay, maybe this guy with his Western education, he'll bring some positive changes.
His wife Asma probably added to that perception too, right?
Oh, for sure. Asma al-Assad, Syrian-born but raised in London. She was a former investment banker.
Very cosmopolitan.
Yeah, totally different image from Hafez's regime, that's for sure. There was definitely a feeling that maybe, just maybe, things were going to change in Syria.
And did they? Did Bashar actually implement any reforms?
Well, he did make a few minor economic tweaks early on, but when it came to real democratization,
Not so much.
let's just say he wasn't too interested. Plus, he kept up his father's habit of, suppressing dissent.
And those ties with militant groups.
Hamas, Hezbollah, still there. Needless to say, a lot of people in the West got disillusioned pretty quickly.
So we have Bashar inheriting this powerful, complicated legacy from his father. But he's not exactly living up to the expectations of those who thought he might actually reform things.
And then in 2011,
This is where it all gets really intense, right?
the Arab Spring arrives in Syria.
And everything changes.
The Arab Spring, it started spreading across the Middle East, and, when it reached Syria,
Ray tests, right?
everywhere, cities all over the country, people were inspired by what they saw happening in Tunisia and Egypt.
They want to change.
Democracy, freedom, the whole 9 yards. It was a direct challenge to the Assad regime, no doubt about it.
So how did Bashar react?
Not well. I mean, instead of even considering what the protesters wanted, he just went full crackdown mode.
Oh, wow.
Security forces, they were everywhere, opening fire on demonstrations, arresting people, torturing activists. He was trying to just crush the uprising with brute force.
I mean, can you imagine the bravery it took for those people to protest, knowing what the regime was capable of? It's incredible.
It really is. But that crackdown, instead of ending things, it actually made everything worse.
It backfired.
Big time. The violence just fueled the anger, the determination, and what started as these peaceful demonstrations, it escalated fast. People started taking up arms against Assad's forces.
That's when the Syrian civil war began.
One of the most devastating conflicts in recent history, and the consequences, they weren't just limited to Syria.
Spilled over into the entire region.
Exactly. Hundreds of thousands of people died in that war. Millions displaced. We saw those images, the refugee camps overflowing, people who had lost everything. It was a humanitarian catastrophe.
And right in the middle of all this chaos, ISIS emerged.
Yeah. The war created this, power vacuum, right? The perfect breeding ground for extremist groups. The Syrian government was so focused on fighting the rebels that they left this opening, and ISIS, which was already gaining strength in Iraq, they swooped right in, took over territory in eastern Syria, and just started imposing their brutal rule.
So the Syrian people, they were stuck between a rock and a hard place. Violence from Assad on one side, the terror of ISIS on the other.
It was a nightmare scenario. And to make things even more complicated, it wasn't just a two-sided war. You had all these different factions popping up, each with their own goals and ambitions. Finding a solution, any kind of resolution, seemed impossible.
And throughout all this, Bashar al-Assad just stayed in power. He ignored the international community's calls to step down. How did he manage to survive all that?
2 words: Russia and Iran.
His allies.
His lifeline. They provided him with tons of military and economic support, kept him afloat.
So even while the U.S., the EU, they were condemning Assad, imposing sanctions, it didn't really matter.
Nope. Russia and Iran's backing, it pretty much shielded him from any real consequences. They turned the Syrian civil war into this proxy conflict, global powers fighting for control, using Syria as their battleground.
And in the end, the Syrian people paid the price.
It's a classic example of how geopolitics can make conflicts so much worse, so much harder to resolve. But amidst all this, there were these horrifying allegations of war crimes, human rights abuses, all being committed by the Assad regime.
We can't forget about that.
Definitely not. We're talking about chemical weapons being used against civilians, a clear violation of international law.
That 2013 chemical attack near Damascus.
Horrific.
Yeah.
The UN called it the worst use of WMDs in this century. Over 1,400 people killed, including hundreds of children. It was a wake-up call for the world. People were outraged, demanding action, accountability.
But Assad just denied everything.
And with Russia backing him up, he managed to avoid any serious repercussions.
It's frustrating, right? You have proof of these atrocities, and yet the international community is powerless to do anything.
It shows you the limits of what we can do, especially when a country has powerful friends willing to protect them, no matter what.
It's a tough reality. But here's the thing. Despite the war, the sanctions, the condemnation, Assad held on. He even held an election in 2021 and won. Of course, everyone in the West said it was rigged, totally fraudulent, but he didn't care.
It was almost like a show of force. I'm still here. I'm still in control.
It really was. He showed that he was willing to do whatever it took to stay in power, even if it meant sacrificing any pretense of democracy.
So now what? Where does Syria go from here? The war has died down, but the country's in ruins, and Assad's still there, firmly in control.
It's a big question mark, isn't it? Rebuilding Syria physically, socially, is going to be an enormous task. And as if things weren't complicated enough already, Bashar al-Assad has been trying to make a comeback on the world stage. It's kind of crazy to see, right?
Yeah.
After years of being isolated, now he's showing up at Arab League summits.
Meeting with world leaders.
Being welcomed back into the fold like nothing happened. It feels like a really calculated move.
Totally. He wants to normalize relations with his regime, even though,
Even though he's been accused of some truly awful things.
It's definitely a controversial move. A lot of people see it as a betrayal,
Especially for the Syrian people, the ones who suffered under his regime.
They see it as the world just brushing everything under the rug, like no big deal. It undermines any hope for justice or accountability.
It's got to feel like a slap in the face. I mean, the war may be over, but the trauma, the pain, it's still there.
Yeah. The scars run deep. Syria's got a long road ahead. Millions of people are still displaced. The economy's a mess, and the threat of extremism is still very real.
Rebuilding a country, physically, socially, after all that. It's a monumental task.
And that's not even considering the whole reconciliation thing, rebuilding trust. It's going to take generations to even begin to heal those wounds.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the rise of Bashar al-Assad, how he inherited this dictatorship from his father, how he brutally crushed an uprising, and how he managed to cling to power despite facing global condemnation. It's a complex story, and we've only scratched the surface, but I think it gives us some valuable insights into this man and the impact he's had, not just on Syria, but on the world.
It makes you think, about power, about how far people are willing to go to keep it, and the limits of international intervention. We see these atrocities happening, but sometimes there's just not much we can do to stop them, and in the end, it's the people who suffer.
It's a sobering thought, for sure. But this deep dive is just a starting point. We want you to keep learning, keep asking questions, keep digging deeper. There's so much more to discover about Syria, about Bashar al-Assad, about the forces that shape our world, and understanding these complexities is more important now than ever.